Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Complexity Lounge, a meetup where we gather to talk about all things related to complexity and complex adaptive systems. I'm Jaka Solberg, and I co-host the lounge together with Barbara Frontera and Tiani Joan. Today, we welcome Dr. Nelson Repenning to the Complexity Lounge. Nelson is the faculty director of the MIT Leadership Center and the distinguished professor of systems dynamics and organization studies at the MIT Sloan School of Management. He holds a BA in economics from Colorado College and a PhD in operations management and systems dynamics from MIT. Today, Nelson will introduce the dynamic work design. DWD is a set of tools that enable managers to redesign the core work of their organizations in ways that align more closely to the existing mental models of the people doing the work. Early anecdotal evidence suggests that this approach holds significant promise for enhancing organizational performance, and we would love to hear about it. Also, he has a book that is newly released today, August 26th. So, Nielsen, welcome to the lounge.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So let me give you a little metaphor to kind of capture my mind state. So I am a live music fan, as probably many of you are. And one of the things that I have grown to love in my fandom is that when you catch an artist or a band on the last night of a big tour, those are often the best performances because, they're kind of punch drunk. They don't care so much anymore. And so you see weird covers and things, deep tracks and so on that you wouldn't normally get if you were in the middle. That's a little bit what this feels like to me. As you saw, I have a new book coming out, which I hopefully will not overly promote during the session today. But hopefully, we're going to do some things that haven't been normally part of the kind of build up to this. So I'm really looking forward to this. Both I love the long format, and Jocko and others have told me that I can definitely use more technical language and we can get into some of the deep tracks that I wouldn't normally do in some of the short podcasts. So the way I've got this organized is there are sort of two distinct parts. I'm going to have some technical stuffs up front that represent some of my earlier work, which basically defines a problem. And then we'll get into the book, some of the work. The second part will be some of the work that is captured in the book, which sort of represents my current thinking about how to solve that particular problem. And because it's sort of solution and practitioner focused, we'll have sort of fewer Greek letters and be a little bit more practitioner focused, but there's a lot of stuff to underlie it. And then the other thing is that these two parts are really separated by what for me was a professional kind of existential crisis. And I want to talk about that a little bit because what that crisis essentially entails is if you buy this basic argument that thinking about complex adaptive systems is a useful lens on social phenomena, right, and it can help us understand some things about how the world works that you might not be able to see with other approaches, how do we get that into the hands of decision makers and policymakers in a way that actually makes the world work better? And I am pretty seriously at odds with my home field, which is system dynamics, on this particular topic. And so I kind of want to tee up that debate and kind of give you a little bit of a sense of how I think about it. And then hopefully that will open the window to a discussion that can really go any direction that you all want to go. And I would also say, at least during COVID, I was pretty good at keeping one eye on the chat while I was talking. So I'm happy to try to answer questions as we go. I'm sure my skills have atrophied a little bit, but I think it'll probably be more engaging for all of us if some of the conversation happens sort of as we sort of roll through this. And so I'm happy to give it a try. But that said, if I get rolling, I may miss a question. So I will count on you all to sort of remind me if there's stuff that has come off the chat. And again, I'm happy to really go any direction that you all find helpful. And most importantly, thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to this. And I think it's a different format than, trying to get my ideas across in 22 minutes, which I've been doing regularly. And so I've been hitting the podcast circuit, trying to sell a few books along the way. So to get started, let me give you the big idea that really kind of defines the book and the work that I do now. And then we'll kind of go back to the beginning and sort of go forward chronologically. And basically, the big idea, I think, is quite straightforward, which is that when you try to impose a static solution on a dynamic problem, you get into lots of trouble. And the version of that trouble that I tend to fixate on most is I'm essentially an organizational theorist by training. Is it leads to companies and large organizations that don't deliver on the things that we count on them for doing. And I think there's a kind of life cycle component to this, which is most organizations at their founding are very dynamic. Think of a bunch of founders scribbling on Starbucks napkins or sitting in their rented space, going back and forth. There are very few roles. Then, if those organizations succeed, they start to need more processes to get things done. So suddenly you have HR and you have finance and so on and so forth. But if you don't manage that evolution carefully, it tends to become a much more rigid, much more static structure. And maintaining dynamism, the ability to adapt to the world around you, starts to become a major design problem. And this is a slide that I use in Exec Ed all the time as an analogy that I think captures it pretty nicely, although I imagine I don't have to convince anyone in the room of this, which is basically what I have on the left there. I don't know what the average age in the room is at this point, but there's probably a few of you that recognize that thing on the left. That was an early incarnation of an in-car GPS system. Back then, it was a separate device. It was not embedded in your phone. There was Garmin and TomTom and a couple other people had it, and it had the suction cup, and you'd stick it on your dashboard and plug it into your cigarette lighter. Cigarette lighters turned out to be the original USB port. We just didn't know it back then. Um, but if you think about how those early GPS systems worked, they were essentially static devices in the sense that if you were to ask it to give you a route, so you're going from Boston to New York, which is a drive I happen to do a lot, it would use a very sophisticated algorithm to calculate the shortest path from point A to point B, and then it would send you on your way. But critically, right, is that it was not an adaptive system in the sense that if there was a traffic jam in Hartford, Connecticut along the way, the early systems would do nothing about that. They had no way of accessing that information. And so those early systems would route you directly into the traffic jam. And then when that happened, as some of you may remember, you had then this very kind of unholy question to answer, which is, do I stick with the GPS system or do I hop off the freeway and freestyle it? Because of course you didn't bring your paper atlas and see if you could find your way, back onto a little bit better route. Okay. Today, of course, the modern traffic apps don't work that way. The other thing I have in my slide is a screenshot from this. I took this right off my phone. This is from Waze, but all the traffic apps work this way. Now, as you all know, they are much more dynamic entities, right? They are constantly sensing the state of the traffic system and will update the route as you go. Okay? The central contention of my research really is that if you look at most corporate planning processes, they look much more like the circa 2000 GPS system than they look like modern traffic apps. That is, if you look at management theory and management practice, it is still largely premised on the assumption that we can predict the future with some degree of accuracy, and we can predict our impact on that future with some degree of accuracy. And I would argue that neither of those things are actually true, and that's where the trouble starts. And the way that I like to demonstrate this to audiences, particularly from large organizations, is I often ask them, how long in your organizations is budget season? Meaning from when your budget goes into effect, how many weeks or months in advance of that do you start planning? And I can see some heads nodding. For small organizations, it tends to be on the order of 3 months. For large organizations, it tends to be the sort of modal answer tends to be about 6 months. Then the second question I ask people is 8 to 9 months. All right, so that's even in the upper reaches there, David. And then the second question I ask them is, okay, once that budget goes into effect, so January 1, July 1, or whatever it is, how long are the assumptions in that budget relevant enough that it is an effective guide for action? Right? And the answer to that question is usually about 3 months. So if you think about this sort of paradox there, right, in many cases, right, we spend twice as much time planning as we do executing because, of course, the world has changed. And the worst part of that is that once the world has changed and the assumptions that underlie that budget are no longer accurate, rather than going back and redoing the budget, we spend the rest of the year trying to make it look like we're following the budget and the strategy when we are, in fact, not. And that's where the trouble starts. And sort of a lot of what I've documented, and we'll come to this a little bit later, is the amount of time and energy and creativity that basically is dedicated to making it look like you're following the plan or the budget when you're not is enormous. And when we can get some of that creativity up to the surface in a more dynamic fashion, the results actually can be quite stunning in terms of the gains that you make. And as the sort of academic of my sort of co-author tag team, a lot of cases I'm kind of scratching my head when I see the results, thinking like there's no way that these numbers could actually be that big. But I've seen it happen enough times that I think the gains are quite substantial. So the big idea here is if you accept the fact that we can't predict the world perfectly and that we need a more dynamic approach, we are very likely to design some of the core processes in an organization differently. And when we do so, we can often make our organizations work a lot better. And again, the gains are big. And then what the book is about, which we'll come to a little bit later, is a set of principles for how you create organizational processes that are at least more dynamic and more capable of reacting to an uncertain world. Okay. So that's the big idea. And again, we'll come back to those pieces a little bit later. But now, what I want to do, and you're the only audience that's getting this version of this, so I hope I've chosen correctly, is kind of go back to the beginning and give you a little bit of my story of how I got to this idea and show you a little bit of the modeling and some of the work that sort of led up to this. And again, please sort of ask questions or make comments along the way. So first off, let me give you my academic lineage. I showed up at MIT on my 23rd birthday, and I joined the System Dynamics group. It is the group I have been in ever since. And our founder and patron saint is this guy, J.W. Forrester. He was an MIT legend, was on our faculty for more than 70 years. Um, Probably he's most famous for he is the inventor of random access coincident core memory that's actually in this photo down here on the bottom left, which was the first really usable, effective memory system for large-scale computing. So he is without a doubt one of the fathers of digital computing. And for those of you that really want to get into the sort of nerdiness, what makes that memory device work is actually a particular nonlinearity in one of the ferrous metals that they used in its design. And I can explain how that works before. But Jay had a really deep understanding of nonlinearity and its impacts. Jay was also did early work at MIT in what was then known as the Servo Mechanisms Lab, which is now the Department of Electrical Engineering, and did basically pioneering and early work in the development of feedback and control systems. And then this is just a sort of little, I think, interesting tangent. This picture I have over here to the right, where he's on the Segway, that's from a party that they had at MIT for the 100th anniversary of the Electrical Engineering Department. And the Segway at that point was a relatively new device. And if you think about the two technologies that are required to make a Segway work, right, you need high-speed digital computing and you need very effective, well-designed feedback and control, both of which Jay is arguably the father of. And so he is literally standing on the fruits of his own labors there as he's piloting that device around the room. Um, Jay's connection to me and my group is he actually left, and some of you may know this story, he left electrical engineering in the end of the 1950s when the Sloan School of Management at MIT was founded. Um, and he came over to Sloan. And back then, when the school was founded, they just basically invited a bunch of faculty from the rest of the institute to come over and teach in the business school. And Jay said, nobody really had any idea what I was going to do. They were just going to give us offices and we would figure it out. And he thought he was going to work on the impact of sort of, computing on business processes. But the birth of system dynamics, the field I'm in, is he was talking to someone an employee at GE about instability that they were suffering in a refrigerator factory. So some years they'd be working 3 shifts, and other years they would be barely have enough demand for 1 shift. And Jay said, and I talked to him about this, he said, I realized that what he was talking about was a feedback system. And from there, system dynamics, the field that I'm in, was born. And basically what system dynamics is it is the application of the feedback and control tools that are widely used in the world of physical and mechanical devices to the social world. And so the system dynamics group, that's basically what we do, is we try to use a variety of kind of approaches to thinking about feedback and control to sort of understand a variety of different social phenomenon. And I'll show you one example in a moment. We are only obviously one small sort of subset of the larger kind of group of people that focus on complex adaptive systems and complexity. And I would say we have a much more engineering-ish mindset than some of our colleagues that are in other versions. Like I'm sure you're all familiar with the work folks at Santa Fe and other places. And if you're interested in that, I can kind of give you my 2 cents on that a little bit later. So that sort of is, he's like my intellectual granddad in some sense. And then my intellectual dad is this guy, John Sturman. He is still a faculty member at MIT. He's the head of the System Dynamics group. Again, some of you may have come across his work. He is most famous for a set of behavioral experiments that basically show that human beings are pretty bad thinkers in dynamic systems. So he's done a huge number of experiments that show that the various mental models and constructs and schema that we bring to bear on dynamic decision-making tasks are pretty inadequate to the complexity of those tasks. And it's just something that we tend not to be good at. And you can construct a variety of evolutionary arguments for this. Dealing with complex sort of long cycle dynamics was probably not something that humanity really had to deal with for most of the time that we've spent on this planet. But as the world has become, much more sort of technically sophisticated and interconnected, now we're facing a set of dynamics that, probably evolution really didn't prepare us for those. And so the ability to model these phenomena, understand them, and manage them is probably something that we are all going to need to master in one set or another. So those are my parents. I showed up at MIT, as I said, in 1991 as a grad student. This was, again, for those of you that are kind of roughly my age, in the business school was the period when the Asian manufacturers, particularly Toyota and Honda, were dominating everything, and we were in these sort of deeply jingoistic concerns that the world was going to be taken over by Japan and that we were going to all lose our jobs and so on and so forth. And so everybody in my department was working on sort of lean and quality related topics. And given that it was MIT, most of it was done by sort of essentially through the lens of applied mathematics. So people were creating sophisticated decision algorithms and quality management tools and so on and so forth. And I remembered thinking I had come from more of a liberal artsy undergrad. I was like, I can't compete with these people, right? There were questions in class. I didn't understand the question, let alone the answer that the professor was giving. And so I was really searching for a research topic. And as all good things in life, very randomly, I happened on this question um, that was turns out to be very heretical, which basically boiled down to did real managers actually use all these tools that we were spending all this time developing? And so I started doing a little research and looked at the literature. And it turned out the answer to that question was at best maybe, and often no. And that really turned out to be the question that I have ended up working on for my entire career. Some version of, why don't people follow the sort of maxim there from President Lincoln in terms of there are a bunch of tools out there that we would all agree are good things to do. And yet, our organizations have a very difficult time, in many cases, making a commitment to using those tools on a regular basis. And the quotes on the bottom actually opens the first sort of introductory chapter of my book. And I think we've all had the experience of walking into work on Monday morning with a set of really big plans for what we're going to get done. And somehow the chaos of the organization sort of prevents us from doing the things that we think are the right things to do. Um, and let me give you just a fast forward a little bit, an extreme version of this. So a lot of this work, which I'll talk about in a moment, happened in the first 10 years or so of my career. And then in the mid 2000s, I was asked by BP to help them investigate a major accident that they had at their Texas City refinery. So this was March 2005. They had an explosion in their isomerization unit, killed 15 people, was at the time, it was the worst industrial accident in the US in over 20 years. We can talk about this in more detail later if you're interested. But what was so shocking about that experience was what is required to run an oil refinery safely is well known. There are books and books and books about it. There are hundreds of experts. Amoco, which was a BP heritage company, had some of the best process safety experts in the world. And yet somehow, BP, I think at the time, was the sixth largest company in the world. The sixth largest company in the world somehow was not able to do the most basic basics on a regular basis and ended up killing 15 people. And that's when I really kind of got evangelized about this topic. Like, we really need to figure this out because there is a lot of knowledge out there that organizations have and they are not using it, right? And the way that I often sort of frames this is organizations often know much more than they do. Okay? So what I want to do next is I actually now want to show you a little mathematical model that will give one explanation for why this happens, why so often organizations struggle to take advantage of some of the knowledge they have. But actually, let me just stop now with that kind of preamble and see if there are sort of questions or comments before I kind of jump into the next little piece. Barbara, I hope I'm not throwing off your pacing here
Oh,
by
oh
stopping.
no.
Okay.
You're running the show. I mean, I do have to say, Nelson, that while you were talking about like, framing the issues, I had to keep reminding myself that you and I have never worked together and that you were not with me on my last engagement. So, um,
Well, it's funny. I have this experience where I will be, talking in class and, I'll show examples for a bunch of different industries and people will often raise their hand, say, okay, well, you've showed us from these 10 different industries, but you didn't mention my industry, so my question is, will this work in my industry? And I always reply to them, I was like, the stuff I teach only works in organizations that have people in them. And I think it's not surprising that these phenomena are very universal. And I don't think it has a lot to do with the underlying technology or industry. It's all about, how does the wonderfully flawed human animal engage with work? And I think as a consequence, you get some very regular failure modes that probably almost anyone could connect with, unless you've been somehow a sole proprietor living in a cabin somewhere in the wilderness or something like that. Deborah, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
Hey, I just wanted to recognize I was working at BP at this time of the horrible tragic accident, and um, I was working with Mark Schwiebert at the time, and when you came
Oh,
in, also with Don Kiefer for a number of years. So I do have a contingent from my current company that we're kind of trying to learn and take on insights here. But yeah, that was really a harsh time, and the lessons learned are they don't stick well, So I think what you're going to be talking about is going to be very helpful for us.
that's
Thanks.
right. I'm guessing you're from the Midwest based on the accent, like me.
Yeah, I'm in Chicago. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's where I grew up, and I know Mark well, and Don obviously, so I'm sure we can kind of reconnect to that. It was really a formative experience for me. I mean, I think there were so many things that BP did so well, which then just made the kind of blind spots they had around safety sort of all the more stunning
So
and kind of hard to fathom and really tragic. And then to basically repeat from an organizational point of view the same phenomenon again 5 years later with the Gulf is really kind of mind blowing. But we can come back to that a little bit later.
I mean,
Okay.
I
Yeah,
just want
sorry, go
to,
ahead.
before we move on, I just want to point out that David and Kyle had an interesting conversation in the chat where, what we're talking about is static budgeting, not reactive budgeting, right? Like it's not like they change the budgeting. It's just that they continue believing that the existing budget will suffice when in fact it does not, and we all just work out, workarounds.
Right, and I think there's actually some deep psychology in here too, which really gets to. So I don't know, Deborah, if you'll remember this, but one of the things I remember from BP so vividly is that, when there was a running joke that when someone say, "Well, I'm not sure I know how to do this," and someone on the other end of the table would reply, "Hey, what part of 17% don't you understand?" Right? With the idea being is that they were treating budgets often, and this is not unique to them. I've seen this in many, many companies is that budgets and targets were essentially incentive devices, right? And so, I gave you this budget because I wanted to make sure that you were working your ass off. Um, this is the quasi-professional part of the presentation. Um, but, it kind of ignored the underlying reality that, sometimes the world went sideways and 17% just was not a realistic target. And as we'll talk about in a moment, what's really dangerous about that is that if 17% is not a realistic target, but I know that my mortgage payment depends on it, I may start doing things to make that target that are going to undermine the long run health of the company. And that's how you end up with Texas City style incidents. And so that's actually a perfect segue to what's coming next. So let me show you first a little model just to get in some dynamics. And it's fun to talk about this because I don't really get to do as much of this stuff anymore. And I won't drag you through all the underlying mathematics, but I'm certainly happy to talk about that if it's helpful. But I want you to imagine a world or an organization where, the revenue you produce, and you can substitute revenue with profit or any other performance measure. This is going to be pretty stylized, is a function of two things. Okay? There's the amount of time you spend working, and then there is your underlying capability or your productivity, right? So if you want to go back to the President Lincoln metaphor, right, there's the number of hours you spend chopping with your axe, and then there is the sharpness of your saw would be the capability, right? And we're going to combine those two things in a very simple way down at the bottom. For those of you that are economists, that is the long, venerable Cobb-Douglas production function. And then we're going to have the occasional environmental shock, right? Sometimes your revenue goes up or down for reasons that really have nothing to you, right? So basically, like in this simple model, your performance is going to be a function of how hard you work, the productivity of that work. Pretty straightforward. Okay? And then this is the system dynamics nomenclature. So, you can see our kind of engineering roots here is we are going to make capability a level or a stock variable or an integration, and which basically means is that it doesn't change right away, right? So just think of it as a bathtub if you're not sort of familiar with that terminology, which is it takes time to increase it, right? So I have that inflow there that's called capability growth. So we have an inflow, and then we have capability erosion. And so the idea is that my productivity at any given moment is sort of the sum total of how much investment I have made in that productivity versus how much it has been allowed to erode. And just adding this one level or stock variable is really important to this whole story because what it means is we have introduced a time delay in the system because what I want to capture here is what I think is a basic sort of physical fact is capabilities tend not to change right away. Okay. Meaning, if I wanted to improve my capability, let's say I wanted to make my refinery more productive, typically I can't just snap my fingers and make that happen, right? I have to send people to training, or I have to invest in upgrading equipment, or I have to practice new techniques for running the board or whatever it might be. And then on the flip side, and this is very important for the story that's going to come, is that if you quit investing in them, so let's imagine we turn off this investment in capability growth, capabilities tend not to go away right away, right? It takes time for them to drain out of the organization. And the example I often give here is if I owned a factory and I suddenly fired all my maintenance mechanics, every piece of equipment doesn't break tomorrow. In fact, if the mechanics have done a good job on maintenance up until this moment, right, I can run that factory for quite a while. But if we don't continue to do maintenance over time, right, defects and wear and tear will creep in there and capability will eventually erode, but it doesn't happen right away, right? And if you want an example closer to home, right, if I decide today, you know what, get my oil change in my car is a pain in the ass, not doing it anymore, my car's not going to break tomorrow, right? With a modern vehicle, I could drive it for quite a long time. But if I never get it maintained again, eventually the engine's going to seize and it's going to be ruined. Okay. And so already, if we look at revenue here, right, what we see is we have two contributions to revenue, how many hours I put in and the capability, and those two inputs change on different time scales, right? Effort, I can change right away. Capability is going to change more slowly. Okay. So here's the big decision, right, in this very simple framework, which is right down here, which is for most processes, I have to constantly decide how much effort do I put into doing the work and how much effort do I put into improving the productivity of that work. Okay. And if you think back to the original problem that I sort of have dedicated my life to, right? All the things that I was studying, whether it was total quality management or safety or lean production or whatever, all of those things were directed at capabilities, right? That they were somehow improving the productivity of that work so that we could get more hours out of that work, or we could get more widgets out of that work for a given hour. Okay? So this is sort of the core problem. How do I allocate my time between doing work and making the investments that would improve the productivity of that particular work? Okay. So it turns out that if you formulate this correctly, you can bring a fair amount of mathematics to it. And if you solve this sort of dynamic program, rationally, right, it turns out that it has a very simple, pretty straightforward solution. There's a lot of math to get there, but the final solution is pretty straightforward, which is basically what you should do, at least in this sort of stylized world, is you should fix the ratio of work to capability, and you should ignore the external shocks, right? So if your revenue goes up or down for reasons that are outside of your control, right, what the optimal solution says is that you should not kind of adjust your energy between doing the work and improving the work. You should basically just stay the course. Okay. Okay, fine. We know that people don't often act rationally, but it also turns out because capability does not change right away, there is an enormously seductive trap in here, which, as you all know, that managers of publicly traded companies in particular are rewarded for steady earnings. Okay? And because capability tends not to change right away, if you are willing to move your effort a little bit from doing work and investing in capability back and forth, as you can see in the lower simulation, you can actually smooth out those variations quite effectively. Okay. So if you look at these two graphs here, the shock, so that S term that I had before in terms of change of performance is exactly the same, right? But because the lower manager is engaging in what we would call earnings management, basically meaning that they're willing to redirect some energy from investing in capability to earnings and vice versa, they can dramatically reduce the variation in their performance. And that company is going to be valued higher on any stock market, right? Because, if you think about beta, right, that goes into the valuation. Now, to be fair, we all do this, right? We are all constantly moving our effort between our sort of long run productivity and getting work done on a regular basis to try to sort of smooth out our impact on the world, right? In my case, it might be on a day that I got a lot to do, right? Maybe I have an extra cup of coffee or a Diet Coke because, that little extra caffeine will help me get my work done today. Of course, I know I'm not going to sleep as well and my capability is going to be eroded because I'm going to be a little bit more tired tomorrow. But if I got a big deadline, it's worth it, right? Or, how many times have we all like clicked the not now button when Microsoft wants to update our software, right? We're postponing investments. Well, maybe with Microsoft, this is a little bit of a dubious example, but bear with me. We're postponing an upgrade to our computing system, assuming that it's an upgrade, right? So that I can get this paper done or get this done, right? So we all do it, right? We basically sort of adjust in a dynamic way our investments in our long run sort of health and capability and our investments in short run stuff to kind of smooth out our impact on the world. Okay. So it turns out if you do a little bit more analysis, the system that I've defined turns out to have a really interesting structure. And it turns out that I can sort of characterize that structure sort of in this sort of simple graph, which just sort of bear with me. What we have across the bottom here is the capability. This is called a rate level plot, by the way. And then what we have up here is the changes in capability. And without sort of dragging you through the mathematical details, what you can show pretty easily is this system, under certain pretty wide range set of conditions, has three equilibria, right? So three steady states in which if the system reaches that point, it will stay there. And it also turns out that equilibria dynamic systems come in two flavors. You have stable and unstable. And it turns out this system has two stable equilibria and one unstable one. So the stable equilibria are this one and the one over here at 0. And then the unstable one is actually in the middle there. And actually, that unstable equilibrium goes under a different label in the common vernacular, which is it's typically known not as an unstable equilibrium, but as a tipping point. And what that means, and again, we can go into the mathematical details that you care about, is that this system has two really different behavior modes depending on where you are relative to that tipping point. So let's imagine we start up here where I drew this first circle. That's where it's supposed to be. Capability is high. And it turns out that in that region of the system, it is what we would call stable, which means the underlying dynamics will tend to drive it back to where we started. So as long as we stay to the right of this dotted line I'm drawing, then those natural variations in capability will go up and down, and we can manage our earnings, and nothing bad is going to happen. Okay. In contrast, if capability is allowed to fall below that tipping point, now we're on a new trajectory, which is where I'm drawing the red line, which is basically into disaster. Okay. And the punchline of all of this, and again, we can go into the details that you're interested in, is that all those little things that we do to kind of go back and forth between getting our work done and investing in capability, as long as that we stay above that tipping point, they have almost zero cost. Okay. We get basically a more stable output and nothing bad happens. But if we ever do it just a little too much and we push the system over that tipping threshold, then suddenly something bad happens. And Jocko, you're exactly right, right? Once we crossed the tipping point, we moved into a different basin, and you can think of that those stable equilibria as a tractor or a basin, if you want, the sort of equivalent for this style. So let me give you an example of why this matters so much. So let's look at a simulation from a version of this model. And imagine we have two managers here. We have an earnings-focused manager, and I thought, Matt, looks like you put in, Deming saying he doesn't give a hoot about profit. So let's imagine that this earning-focused manager here, I don't know, who would be our most earnings-focused manager in the world right now? I'm not sure who I'd put in that category, right? So maybe this is Jamie Dimon right here. And then we have Deming managing this company right here, right? Deming doesn't give a crap about earnings. He's just going to focus on capability. And Jamie Dimon is going to be moving effort, back and forth to try to keep those earnings as stable as possible so they meet their guidance, every time, right? Which stock would you like better, right? Pretty clear, right? Jamie Dimon, the earnings focused manager, has much less variation, right? Every stock market in the world, every investment manager in the world is going to value that company higher. Okay. Now, the means actually are exactly the same, sort of by construction, but by being willing to move effort back and forth between capability and effort, right, you get a much more stable set of earnings. Okay. Seems great, right? So I definitely want the solid line rather than the gray sort of variable line here. Okay. But now let me show you another sample path, okay? All the parameters here are the same. We just get a different draw from that random distribution of the shocks we've showed before. And now what you see is that the earnings focused manager runs a very stable company until, right, he happens to get a shock that's big enough that pushes them over that tipping threshold. And now you get into disaster. Okay. Now, I have studied, and I'm happy to post some links to papers. I built a dozen different versions of this model and studied it from every sort of possible angle you can imagine. And basically, my answer to the question of why don't people do new stuff is that, and we have some experimental, yeah, exactly. Jamie's fine until his business collapses. Now, we'll talk about some of those other dynamics in a moment, Jocko, is that what makes this system hard and all the different variants is that the dynamics are counterintuitive, and most people, unless they understand this stuff deeply, are just not good at managing systems that have this sort of tipping threshold kind of behavior. Because if you think about it, you can kind of it's a place where local learning is not a good guide to the sort of global behavior of the system because every time I push a little harder and I manage earnings a little bit better, I'm rewarded for it. Things get more stable, we're better off, I make my numbers until it doesn't work anymore, right? And then suddenly, once you go over that tipping threshold, you get into a whole new regime, and then something really bad can happen. And so, Deborah, I hope I don't bring back past trauma from showing this. Let me just give you sort of one example. So this is just a slide from that accident investigation that I talked about before. So in 2005, BP had this awful accident in its Texas City refinery. Again, 15 fatalities, a tragedy by any measure. And what I have sort of pulled out there is a quote from the investigation report from the U.S. Chemical Safety Board. And what you can see here is that basically what BP did is, in the interest of profitability, is they kept cutting and cutting, right? So they cut maintenance, they cut staff, and for many, many years, they were rewarded for doing so, right? Every time they cut back a little bit on maintenance, or they outsourced the maintenance, or they switched to computer-based training, things would get a little bit better, their profit would be a little bit better, and nothing bad happened, right? And that's exactly what the model would suggest. As long as you're above the tipping point, things are fine. But systems with these sort of tipping threshold kinds of properties tend not to give you a lot of clear warnings when you're getting close to the edge, and then you push it over the edge and something really, really bad happens. And we have seen this in lots of different systems. I saw someone, yeah, David, you put in Boeing. I am less familiar with the internal dynamics there, so I don't think I know much more than you, but I would be very surprised if they didn't have a very sort of similar set of dynamics. And certainly what I know with the 737 MAX, where they basically tried to kind of get those design changes, under the wire of a past certification, is a perfect example of kind of focusing on delivery over those underlying capabilities. And, that they had some bad luck and it came back to bite them in the backside. And, you would hope had they done the certification correctly, you would have, that you would have caught that. So I think two things to kind of say about this, and I see a lot of questions, and so maybe we time to stop and have some conversation about it, which is number one, I think we have seen versions of this kind of what we call this the capability trap, by the way, this dynamic in almost every different company we've worked with. Most companies don't have the risk profile of an oil and gas company, so you don't get, an explosion or something like that that can get you in trouble. But you see lots of organizations that have kind of descended into this sort of permanent firefighting mode, with basically what has happened is they've gone over the tipping threshold. They're putting all their time and energy into delivering short-term results, and they're investing little to nothing in those upfront investments that would have gotten them out of that mess in the first place. And then the second thing is if you are in an organization, that is kind of down here, right, where they've already gone over that tipping threshold, trying to introduce any new tool or process is virtually impossible, right? Because people are fully consumed with just kind of holding things together on a day-to-day basis that they, have essentially zero time to do that, right? So, one of the little catchphrases I've been using with the book is that when you live where that red circle is, basically the system is managing you rather than you are managing it, because you show up at work and you're just kind of dealing with all the fires that are out there, rather than what is the next investment I need to make in order to get us to the next level of performance. Okay. Let me stop for questions, and I will also say I have multiple papers that sort of talk about this from every kind of conceivable angle, which I'm happy to make available to you. But that's sort of the high level message.
Okay, that would be great. So
Yeah.
because if you share those with us, we'll put them in with the recording so that people can access them through YouTube. But let's go with Kyle first. So Kyle, do you want to ask your question, or are you going to make me read this?
No. Yeah, so I'll summarize. Thanks. So was love the idea, the capability erosion. I'm in process and moved into service design and B2B, and been doing this in large organizations. And I work in typically federalized tech infrastructure where we're going to change something and do a screen test, and we'll find out later. And any of the recovery from that is out of scope from whatever that core project is. And so now it's, well, we'll hire somebody to email a third party to do some band-aid work, or we'll build some microservice that will do some translation layer of whatever got left behind from a legacy system that couldn't convert over because it was too much trouble. And so I'm usually trying to reconnect and, show the impacts of these, now trying to get in front of a lot of that, but there's a lot of recovery work here. And so as I'm seeing the curve you've got here, I'm thinking that curve happened years ago when I show up on site. So I, the two questions I had, one is, what does that recovery look like? The other is I'm thinking about the decoupling component. You were talking about the average life of capabilities. That decoupling in that federated space, would you consider that to be erosion, since that is not it doesn't seem like a true life cycle, or is that more of the shock you were talking about?
So that's a great question, and I'm not sure I have the definitive answer. So let me say a couple things, and then maybe you can I can go back and forth. One thing that I would say that I think was really revealing about the oil and gas work, and particularly that Texas City investigation, is one of the things I came to appreciate is I think that industry is one of the hardest ones to learn the right lessons, and the reason is that you can do it wrong for a really long period of time, and then when something goes wrong, it's really bad, right? So, um, you know, depending on how you count, that Texas City incident was somewhere between 5 and 10 years in the making, in terms of, there was just a steady erosion of capability. They went through a bunch of different plant managers. They kept cutting back on the budget and rewarded. Stock market loved BP before this. And then again, when something bad happens, boy, it's pretty ugly. You go way into this sort of other end of the spectrum. Imagine you have a sole website that you're putting up, to sell your product. I make a couple changes, I put it up over the weekend. If it crashes, I take it down, I fix it. Nobody died, right? And so I think in that latter category, a kind of local naive learning probably works basically fine, right? You may lose a few sales, but they kind of try it and then we'll, fix it when it doesn't work. Probably isn't the worst idea in the world. And I'm sure, there's a few practices you could place to offset some of the bigger problems. I will say, as a small editorial tangent from this, one of the things that I really worried about at the moment, based on what I see of my students at MIT, is what I call the Silicon Valley itization of management, which is, the sort of most powerful, richest people in the world have come from kind of information, sort of IT related companies that in many cases, don't have a huge risk profile. Now, we could talk about the risk of social media to our kids, but that's sort of a separate thing. But, if Facebook crashes this weekend, no one's going to die. And so I think it has kind of led a lot of people to believe that, well, we just build it and then when it breaks, we fix it culture is totally fine for lots of other industries that are not like what's happening in the Valley. And that scares me a little bit, to be honest, because I think that is a very dangerous mindset to apply to other places. I think for what you described, Kyle, is, you're probably somewhere in the middle between, the Friday afternoon website and, a nuclear power plant or an oil refinery. And if I understood your question, you're probably walking into situations that have lots of technical debt and legacy architecture and are trying to put sort of those pieces together. I think it's a big challenge to walk out of that. And I think when we get to the dynamic work design stuff, I will give you sort of my 2 cents on how to manage that. But basically, I think for most organizations, just a little preview of coming attractions, right? The way out of that is going to be incrementally solving problems and building real capability. Because let me draw a little picture here. Imagine that you're already in the capability trap. So capability is very low. And you say one day when you come in, like, you know what? We're going to fix all this broken stuff, everything, right? Well, if you do that, right, then you get kind of the mirror dynamic, which is things are tend going to get a lot worse before they get better. And most organizations, unless it's a real crisis, right, just are not going to have the stomach for months and months or years and years of low performance to get back out of it. I remember, just to give you an example, when I did my dissertation, which was a million years ago, it was at Ford, and they were one of the big change initiatives was they were switching to more digital design tools to design cars. Um, this is a long time ago, rudimentary by today's standards, but they changed everything. They had new workstations, they had new design processes, new design rules, they hired new engineers, they had new suppliers, and so on and so forth. And then they were shocked when engineers were using these fancy new $1 million workstations as holders for Post-its and that nobody was using the digital tools. And of course, the reason for that is that there was this huge amount of work they needed to do to learn the new tools, but none of their regular work went away. And so they were still sort of designing cars the old way. And so essentially what had happened is they had completely ignored the fact that things were going to get worse before they were going to get better. And so they hadn't really managed that. And so what we'll talk about in a moment is where possible, I think it works a lot better to kind of break that worse before better into lots of little bite-sized pieces. The reason I don't have the definitive answer to your question is because my knowledge of kind of big software technical architectures is I just am not fully confident that you can fix all of those in little bite-sized pieces. I imagine that there are moments where you do have to kind of bite the bullet on infrastructure. And I think in that case, I really only have one piece of advice, which is walk into it with your eyes open in the sense of like, if you know that things are going to get worse for 6 months, you need to be honest about that up front because I've had lots of former students and I always tell them, and I hope you can see my, having a difficult
Mhm.
conversation about worse before better is hard here. It's not nearly as hard as the one you have here, right? When you told the boss that, yeah, things will be better in 3 months, and then 18 months into the project, it still hasn't turned, that's typically not super good for your career. So it sounds like you're in a pretty thorny situation. And, I'd be happy
Yeah,
to chat more about that
yeah.
offline, but
This tracks, and usually the opening to all of this is what we really need to do is hit the reset button and just start all
right,
over.
right,
But that's not possible. I'm in healthcare, and it's not that people are going to be inconvenienced for a moment. It's that people don't get diagnostics for however
right.
long we're shut down. So parallel path is the only answer, really, and that's too expensive to be realistic. So what's the compromise?
Right. And knowing only what you just described to me, what about that would make me nervous is that you're going to continue forward with the best of intentions with the duct tape and safety pins until
Bingo.
something really bad happens. And
Yep.
then suddenly there's going to be this mandate. And it's funny, I don't know if any of you are Massachusetts residents, but I think about this all the time with our subway. Every month there's another little something that goes wrong. And, someday, sadly, something really bad is going to happen. And then there's going to be all these blue ribbon commissions about, well, how come we didn't see this coming? And so on and so forth. It's like the evidence is right in front of us, but it's hard to muster the political will until, you have something that's made the evening news. And then, what is it? It's Kierkegaard, life is lived forward, but understood backward or something like that, right? Which really gets in the way, I think, sometimes of doing the right stuff.
Exactly.
So best of
Exactly.
luck. That's not an easy situation you're managing.
Appreciate it.
Kinsey, I think you have your hand up.
Questions? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I do. It's made me think, what made me think of it was when you're talking about the disaster, well, the disasters, and how there was erosion that takes place over time, over a long period of time in terms of corporate temporal horizons. And I was curious about whether the erosion was of things that they were aware of and maybe tracking, or just it was on their radar, or if it was something that they didn't realize how consequential it would be. And the correlation I'm making with what I'm working with right now is in terms of AI development. And some people on the call have heard me talk about this in our complexity groups. I have found that my focus is bias research at a systemic level from the 19th century to the present. And I've been working as a subject matter expert for my field, but in practice, I look at organizational policy and practice and how bias manifests in the present day, but comes from legacies long past, and there isn't that awareness. And so this company I was working for, I have very clear things that could be done at this point to establish a foundation and practice as they scale that would mitigate biases that, it's inevitable that there be some built in that come from past practices and systems. But and I've been trying to meet with somebody, and the answer I get is, well, maybe in a few months, because we're busy launching and scaling. And what I've mentioned some things, but it's just something that they don't relate to because it isn't tech related, and it's the consequence isn't immediate enough, and it's over a long term, like decades. Although I think that it'll be more rapid now because the pace of of development is more rapid. But and so there's not the awareness and there's not that tracking, but there is externally. And so I'm curious about if there was an internally there, and if there is externally, how one might get that into an internal consciousness?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I'd say at least two things about it, which is number one, there's a basic asymmetry, or I'm not going to go back in my slides. And the asymmetry is that if you go back to my little thing where you have, effort and capability leading to revenue, the first asymmetry is that revenue or profit or whatever, the end performance measure is always going to be easier to measure than the underlying capabilities that created it. Right. So if you go back to BP as just an example, right, it's always going to be easier to measure the number of barrels of oil that the refinery produced rather than the quality of their maintenance system, right? And so just that little bias of, we tend as human beings to anchor on things that we can quantify clearly. And so, there's a reason that managers tend to gravitate towards share prices and revenue and profits and so on and so forth, which is it's just more appealing psychologically. That said, certainly in the BP case, but in many other investigations I have worked on, if you know what you're doing, meaning that you know what good maintenance practices look like, or if you've spent some time in that area, there are always signs of trouble. The problem is that they tend to be sort of more qualitative and they require some experience to really interpret them correctly. And those are the things that when you see them kind of going forward, they say, well, I don't know, maybe we have a problem here, maybe we don't. And then when you look at them backwards after something bad has happened, how could we have missed all this bad stuff that's happening here? So I don't know a lot about your particular case. I'd be shocked if that there were not signs of trouble in the work. And that will lead to something that we'll talk about when we shift gears here in a moment, which is one of the things that will pop out of this, which will probably not be directly obvious basically on what I've said before, but one of the keys to beating this sort of dynamic that we've been talking about is you really need to be in touch with how the work actually gets done. And I think when you are in touch with how the work gets done, you can get that more kind of qualitative sense. If you take the BP case, right, if you look at the precursors to that incident, the fabric maintenance budget in the previous 5 years fell by about 80%. They had two 25% cost cuts posted on them. They cut their training staff, I think, from 28 people to 8. They switched to computer-based training. They'd had multiple individual fatalities and I mean, there were more warning signs that you knew what to do with, but none of them had really kind of gotten over the threshold that it was really on people's radar. So that in the organizational literature, these are called weak signals. So that, they were weak signals here and forward. But again, you had to be a somewhat experienced person to know what you were looking for in that case. And so I think that asymmetry is one of the really hard problems here because you need people that sort of know what they're doing. And I will say one more thing, and I know we need to move forward. In my experience, if you ever meet a manager who has had a fatality happen on his or her watch, that person is never the same afterwards, right? It is just such a traumatic experience that their view of the world is, irreparably changed. But one thing you will see in those people is they have a set of, bright lines in their head that they are never willing to cross. And, they will say things like, look, if you want to do it this way, then I quit, right? And unless you have had that traumatic experience, right, the rest of the folks often don't have that sort of strict set of standards. And the world would be a better place if we could find a way to help people develop those standards without having to had a fatality happen in their, in their watch or whatever the sort of the equivalent is in your organization. So
I'm surprised that proximity isn't enough to have a ripple effect when that happens.
Well, so it's interesting, and Barbara will probably attest to this. There is a very damning New Yorker article that happened, I think, after the Gulf oil spill, where at the time BP was really obsessed with personal safety, so slips, trips, and falls. And so, if you were walking around St. James, their office in London, and you didn't have a cover on their coffee cup, somebody would stop you and make you put a cover on it. Or if you weren't holding the handrail when you walked downstairs, right, someone would reach out and take your hand and put it on the handrail. These are good practices, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But yet there were these enormous process safety risks right in their midst that just weren't on their radar. And yet, if you talk to the operators on the ground, they could have told you everything that was sort of going wrong. So it was there was some management hubris that was probably involved in that as well. Yeah. So
We
David,
had one more. Oh,
Yeah,
sorry. We
sorry.
had one
Who's
more
next?
question that came in just before Kinsey's question. I thought we could maybe do that and then
Yep.
do want to go. And Aaron, did you want to go ahead
Yeah,
and talk
no,
about your
no.
question?
Thank you so much. And once again, thanks for this forum and thank you so much, Professor, for all your time here. I'm wondering because I kind of try to live by, it's hard, but the sort of the skin in the game, kind of red teaming kind of thinking, and a lot of that comes from I spent 15 years in the Army, and I and that works well and it doesn't work well. But the point is that there is a culture, or at least a subculture there that takes that very seriously. And I've noticed in the corporate world the last 20 plus years, 25 years, that trying to get people to uh, anchor to some skin in the game thinking or red teaming is a big challenge. People want to deflect, they want to rent seek, they constantly want to bypass, etc. And I'm wondering how much of the mismatch, the asymmetry that you see between sort of the capabilities and the equilibrium has to do with the lack of real skin in the game and red teaming, which of course, if you have a lot of skin in the game, odds are you're more likely to want to simulate different risk outcomes, different pathways, different path dependencies, because you have a big chance to lose not just money, but maybe your career, or maybe you have to go to jail, whatever. And so, I'm just wondering what your thinking is there, if that ever entered into any of your
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I have thought about it quite a bit. So there's a whole sub-literature in risk analysis that's called risk perception, and basically it boils down to which risks do we weight highly and which ones do we don't, and it produces a lot of really kind of comical findings. Like one of the most famous studies is they ask people, what are you more likely to die from, a shark attack or a falling airplane part, right? Some of you may have heard this. It turns out that you're actually like 30 times more likely to die from a falling airplane part. But of course, everybody answered shark attack. And the reason is because this survey had been done right around the proximity to the movie Jaws. And so, everybody could conjure shark attack in their head. And so what this study demonstrates, and there's a zillion others, is that we rate risks more highly when we can conjure a sort of visceral image of it in our head, right? And what's going on there is the emotional system is kind of like bookmarks to our experience, right? When we have a strong emotional experience, we can tend to recall that. And so you probably all had the experience that, certain smells and certain sounds like will bring you right back to particular places. One of the things I think is very problematic for this risk analysis is, and this is unique to BP, I could talk about any places, is, you see a PowerPoint slide that has a bunch of graphs and statistics. Oh, we have a 15% risk of that and a 20% risk of that. Like that has no emotional valence whatsoever. And so I think it's very easy. I don't think the folks that ran BP were bad people, even the ones that, imposed these budget cut after budget cut after budget cut. But I think the flaw in that model was in their kind of leadership protocol and how they spent their time. They didn't have an opportunity to get some of those kind of visceral experiences of what it's like to have things go wrong, right? Whether that's meet someone on, that worked in the refinery or sit there for an emergency drill or, meet their families and kids and so on and so forth. And so I do think this is an undermined area of finding ways to give particularly senior leaders that more emotional hook to what it's like when something goes wrong, I think is a big deal. I don't have a lot of experience in sort of red team sort of simulations or exercises, but I imagine those could be constructed in ways that, like it really feels bad when stuff starts to go sideways. And that would, I have a colleague, John Sturman, who I alluded to earlier, that works on climate related stuff a lot. And he often opens his talks by saying, research shows that sowing research doesn't change their minds. And so we need to come up with other communication methods to help people appreciate these risks because, it's very clear that graphs and charts just don't do it. So yeah, I think there's some challenges there. And I think once you understand psychology, it opens up at least some experiments to run or some other possibilities that we might consider.
Thank you so much. And it also says that we probably deserve instead of Shark Week, Plane Part Week.
Yeah, exactly.
A whole bunch of
Exactly
shows
right.
of plane parts falling. So
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah, do we want to move on to the next topic? We had
Yeah,
a couple more questions, and also uh yeah, so we can do that if you want to, and then come back to some of the other
yeah.
questions.
Let me move forward, and then we can
Okay.
come back to some of these. We are now about 15 years into my career, and I have a kind of what I think is a sort of omnibus diagnosis of a class of problems that I think are pretty important. And so one version of this that we haven't talked that much that's kind of corollary to this is I did a lot of work in research and development, and one of the basic findings from all that work was if you overloaded your product development process, put too many projects in, you were virtually guaranteeing that you were going to kind of push yourself over that tipping threshold, right? So overloading your organization is sort of an express lane into firefighting and going over that equilibrium, all that stuff we talked about. And so for probably 10 or 15 years, I would go out on the rubber chicken speaking circuit and I would always tell leaders, you need to be more disciplined about putting fewer projects into your R&D portfolio, and they would all nod their heads and say, "Oh, you're exactly right," and then nothing would change. It was having zero impact on the world. And then this is kind of where my existential crisis happened. So in the field of system dynamics that I come from, our kind of theory of the case about how we were going to change the world had sort of two evolutions. The first version was kind of back in the Jay Forrester days, is that someday we would teach all senior executives to be modelers themselves. Because, the one thing that I can think you say with a lot of confidence in all the different sort of complex adaptive system field is the person who does the analysis, builds the model, learns an enormous amount about how that system works. It is an amazingly educational process. Okay. Uh, you know, I took 5 semesters of accounting as an undergrad at my parents' behest. I was not very happy about it, but actually it served me well. And I remember I was building a model for John where I had to kind of build the stock and flow structure of a sort of standard set of financial statements. And I never understood accounting as well as I did once I actually had to turn it into code and like build a simulating model. So it's enormously educational. That said, totally unrealistic. Chief executive officers are not going to have a computer on their desk and building simulation models of their companies. So then the second evolution was the birth of what in the field we called management flight simulators, which was basically, well, let's take these models and turn them into games, right? And so then if people sit down and they experience these dynamics firsthand and they play the game, maybe that will change their minds enough that they will go back to their organizations and behave differently. And I would say that's still where the field is today. Um, and this is where my former thesis advisor, John, and I have, some endless debates. I just don't see a lot of evidence that it works. And if you go to the System Dynamics conference every year, for my taste, it's a little whiny in the sense that there's a lot of, we are so smart, we understand these systems so well, and we have all these deep insights, and why won't the rest of the world that's leading these organizations listen to us? Isn't this frustrating? And yes, it is enormously frustrating. And I do think we have insights that we could help, but they're perfectly happy doing what they're doing. So we got to find a different way of kind of packaging these insights so that practitioners can actually use them. And I am less familiar with what's happening in the rest of the complex adaptive system world, but I'm reasonably confident that this problem is not unique to system dynamics, right? We have to find a different way of accessing the hearts and minds of the people that are out there running the world, because clearly it's not going that well. And I think we have a lot to offer. So the birth of the book and dynamic work design has really been my attempt at an alternate way of getting these insights into the hands of practitioners in the way that they can use them. And I'll give you actually one other version of this problem. One of the reasons it became such an existential crisis is when I would teach my system dynamics course at MIT, which I taught for 20 plus years, the way the course was designed is that the last day was always the greatest hits of system dynamics. And so we would show a bunch of case studies of where the tools had been, dramatically successful in saving all this money and creating new businesses and so on. And it really bugged me that I was using the same examples over and over and over and over again. And I was like, there's something wrong here when the field is not sort of cranking these out. I now teach a project class using dynamic work design, and any year of that class has 100 students produces more gains than all my system dynamics classes through my whole career. Okay? Now, that's just one sample size, but this sort of alternative approach that I'm about to sort of offer up has, at least for me, been far more impactful in terms of getting insights into the heads of managers in the way that they can use. And basically, this approach is to take the model that we've just developed and try to derive from that some tools and actionable insights that managers can go take and use right away, right? And another way of saying this is that the kind of thesis of system dynamics is the world's a really complicated place. And so we have to train people to be modelers so that they can understand that complexity. Dynamic work design, which is this sort of methodology that my colleague and I have created, I think kind of tackles the problem from the other direction, which is we have come up with a set of tools or principles so that you can redesign the work in ways that it's simple enough that a smart person unaided by other sort of tools can be successful in that environment. And again, I'm only speaking for myself. We'll see how the book does, but I've had a lot better luck going that route than the other route. Now, again, my colleagues in system dynamics hate me for this, and we have lots of spirited debates about this, but and we can come back to this a little bit later. So, what is this approach? Well, what I want to do is actually, I want to start with a very simple project. This is one of the ones that we describe in the book. It's one of my favorites because it is so simple, but I think if you kind of understand what's going on here, you'll really get the essence of what we're after. So the person who did this project is a former student of ours. His name is David Whiting, and at the time he was the chief operating officer for Standard Chartered Bank. If you're from the US, you may never heard them, but it's they're very big in Asia and Africa. And, it's a multi-billion-dollar sort of lending institution. And as the chief operating officer, he was responsible. So they, and like all big banks, they did IT projects, and they had sort of four phases. And as the chief operating officer, he was responsible for an approvals phase where IT projects would have to come to the COO's office and be risk assessed. And he had a staff of 16 risk experts who would look at each project and make sure that it was safe to go forward, right? So this sort of fairly predictable, you had a cyber risk expert, you had, someone responsible for the customer experience and so on, right? So every project that they did at Standard Charter had to be signed off by these 16 risk experts. Okay? At the outset, it took 120 days for his office to get this sign off done. And as David started to sort of dig in when he inherited this, why the process was, running so poorly, his big insight was, he said, I realized that the process was gated by the risk manager who thought the project was least important. Okay, right? So you imagine if it's a project that has a big cyber footprint, okay, the cyber security expert's probably going to be all over that. But there might be someone who is, doesn't have a big risk, got lots of other stuff to do, right? Very hard to get their attention so that they can sign off on that particular project. Now we get this sort of very long delay. So David made a really clear intervention using some of the dynamic work design principles, which we'll come to in a moment. But here is basically the intervention. He instituted a week-long meeting, just an hour, and the meeting was guided by what he called a common backlog. And all the common backlog was a rank-ordered list of all the projects that they were supposed to approve and ranked 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. And then the way the meeting was run is that all 16 risk experts and David would get together and they would just work on the project on the top of the list until it was done. And then they move on to the next one. Okay. So just an hour a week, very simple. They were able to cut the approval time from 120 days to 20. And using Standard Charter's own math, the savings associated with this was on the order of $250 million. Okay. Now, I can't say that every dynamic work design project yields quite that amount of money, but it's pretty impressive for an hour-long meeting. And this actually has almost all the dynamic work design principles sort of embedded. And Mesbah, you're exactly right. There's a lot of agile embedded in here, and we'll come to the connections to that in a moment. But now I want to do is sort of show you what I mean by dynamic work design, and then we'll kind of loop back to this project because I think it's little projects like this that are actually the solution in a strange way to the problems that we've been talking about before. Okay. So, what is it? Well, so what my co-author Don and I have done through many years of the work that we have done is we've identified what we believe to be sort of 5 principles for designing effective work in dynamic environments. And right, this will take us right back to where we started, which is if we accept the fact that the world is not perfectly predictable, nor can we predict our impact on it, we might want to design our core processes a little bit differently. And I'll go through the principles quickly, and then we'll do a little bit deeper dive into 2 of them. The first principle is solve the right problem and solve the problem right. This is just basically a charge to use sort of simple structured problem solving methods when you come across a thorny issue. This is nothing more than using the lessons from the scientific method you probably learned in the 7th grade. We have our own version of this called the A3, which I can introduce you to if you're interested. Second principle is what we call structure for discovery. One of the things that we've discovered in a lot of the interventions we've done is that when you really look at how many jobs are designed, particularly sort of in the lower levels of the organization, right? No one ever thought about what people were actually learning in the day-to-day work. And those job designs often teach people exactly the wrong lessons in terms of what is actually important. Third principle is what we call connect the human chain. We have come to believe that, particularly in a dynamic environment, face-to-face interactions are one of your most valuable and expensive resources. The reason they're valuable is because face-to-face discussion is probably the fastest way to process the uncertainty created by a dynamic world. But it's really expensive because if I have a meeting with 10 people, right, that's 10 hours of work that's not getting done for the organization. So the essence of this principle is how do we put that face-to-face connections in the right places where we can maximize the stuff that it's good for. Fourth principle is what we call regulate the flow. And I kind of alluded to this earlier, which is we want to make sure that we have the right amount of work in the system. And then the fifth one is what we call visualize the work. And the basic idea there is that one of the things that makes managing knowledge work really hard is you can't see it, right? If you think about a factory, like my colleague Don Kiefer used to work at Harley Davidson. At one point, he ran the engine plant. If the assembly line making engines or cars breaks, we know almost immediately that something's gone wrong, right? The system gives us a clear signal that something's gone sideways. Knowledge work has no equivalent, right? Somebody who works for you could be getting stuck doing their work right now, right? But there is no signal that you're going to get necessarily to tell you that something's gone wrong. And so the essence of this principle is simply, can we create simple visualization tools for knowledge work so that we can see how the work moves through your organization? And more importantly, when the work is actually not moving. Yeah, Kanban, David, is a perfect example, sort of a subset or an example of that, which we can talk about if we have time. Okay. Now, I don't have time to go through all of these, but let me just give you a quick intro to 2 of them. The first one we'll talk about is connect the human chain. That is, how do we put human connection in the right places? And the way I'll motivate this, and I imagine I'm not surprising anyone here, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of books and papers about how to have better meetings, right? Go type, how to have a better meeting in Google. You will get a gazillion hits. But I've actually come to believe that these papers are asking the wrong question, which is we don't want to have good meetings as end unto themselves, although it is actually probably more pleasant to have a good meeting than a bad one, right? What we want is effective processes. And what Don and I have discovered is that if we introduce meetings as a part of creating a good process, we will actually end up with better meetings than if we just try to fix the meetings themselves. And so the sort of big question here is, are there some ideas or some theory out there that could help us put meetings in the right places? And so let me give you a simple way of thinking about that. If you were to take a traditional organizational design class, any business school, mine or otherwise, one of the first things that we would teach you is a very simple idea that's known as contingency theory. If you haven't figured it out by now, the way to be a successful social scientist is come up with a big jargon-filled label for a very commonplace idea. And what contingency theory says is really simple, which is basically match the design of the work to the amount of uncertainty that is inherent in that particular task. And contingency theory tends to talk about 2 extreme designs. right, are the bane of business schools. I would disagree, David. They are like the foundation of business schools, actually. We couldn't live without them. Same goes for all of sociology, by the way, too, if we have any sociologists in the group. Um, but in contingency theory, the basic idea is the work is very precise, right? So imagine making widgets in assembly line or paying in, issuing paychecks every month. Then we don't need a lot of communication. And so there we can use what we nowadays would call a factory design, right? Which is we would design the work serially, right? I do my work, I hand it to David. David knows exactly what he's getting. David did his work. He hands it to Tiani. Tiani knows exactly what she's getting. She does her work, right? So we just move it through in sequence. And that design works fine because we have very low communication requirements at each of those junctures. Okay. In contrast, if the work is highly uncertain and ambiguous, let's imagine the three of us are designing a new product or we're writing a script for our Netflix series that we want to do or whatever it might be, then there are no clear handoffs. And so what contingency theory preaches there is what we would call a studio design, which basically boils down to if we're doing something very creative, David, Tiani, and I should just sit in a room together with chocolate and caffeine and candy and let the communication patterns sort of flow freely. Okay. And so basically, and I'm taking years of work and thousands of pages of research and consolidating it into the all important 2x2 matrix. But basically, if you take this kind of contingency theory notion seriously, if you are the would-be work designer in your organization, your job is basically to pick the box, right? You evaluate the kind of work you're designing. Is it highly precise and stable or highly uncertain and ambiguous? And then choose the appropriate work design to match. Okay. And we taught this for 70 plus years. This goes all the way back to Burns and Stalker and stuff that happened a long time ago. Okay? Now, this might strike you as kind of silly and a little bit static, and I would agree with you. Even though I taught this, this approach always sort of bugged me because, it always seemed like, real work wasn't that simple, and it must be sort of a mix between the two. And so clearly there's this continuum between kind of precise work and ambiguous work. And so maybe what we just need to do is realize that these are two sort of ends on a spectrum, and we just need to pick the spot. Okay. But what I finally realized once you take a more dynamic lens is this idea that we need to pick the spot between the two endpoints wasn't really capturing what was going on. And this was revealed to me many years ago when I took a benchmarking trip to Japan and I got to go visit a couple Toyota facilities. And there was one particular experience that really sort of nailed for me. All right, David, you can't make me laugh while I'm talking. There was one experience that sort of nailed for me the problem with this model. So I was visiting a Toyota supplier that makes trunk latches, super sexy part of the business. So if you own a Toyota vehicle, you probably have a trunk latch from this factory. If you're a factory nerd like I am, this is one of the most well-designed pieces of work I've ever seen. And my colleague Don and I were watching kind of the main assembly operation. And so there was an operator who would grab a housing, grab a couple parts, put it in the housing, pull a spring across it, put the other half of the housing on, put a bolt through it, hand it on to the next person. So in 60 seconds, she's doing about 12 different operations. I mean, this was as well designed a piece of work as you'll ever come across. And at that point, I would have told you what made Toyota Toyota was they were better at this stuff than anybody in the world. Okay. Now, while we're watching, something goes wrong. Okay? She can't get the trunk latch assembled in the allotted 60 seconds. So what does she do? Right? Well, you all know the mythology of Toyota, right? When you have a defect or whatever, what are you supposed to do? David's exactly right. You pull the cord, stop the line. Okay. Now, in this plant, actually, it wasn't a cord, it was a big yellow button, but it had the same impact. Hit the button, an alarm goes off, and a yellow light flashes. Okay. Now, what happens next? Well, what happens next is a supervisor comes over. He was actually ran over, which I think might have been a safety violation, but that's a topic for another time. Supervisor comes running over, has a 60-second conversation with the operator. I do not speak Japanese, so I assume they were talking about solving the problem. They might have been talking about baseball for all I know, but they were able to diagnose the problem, which is a material handler had basically dropped a box of parts down and put it down in the wrong orientation. So when the operator reached into the box of parts, the parts weren't where she was used to seeing them. Easy solution, rotate the box, no problem. Okay. And if you've ever read a book or a paper on Toyota, that basic scene has been repeated in thousands of different sort of outlets. Okay? But what I realized in that moment, and then on the very long plane flight on the way back, is the problem with this model, this kind of contingency theory model, was not that you were supposed to pick your spot between the two kind of endpoints. It's too static, right? What happens in real work is that we are constantly moving between these two boxes, between routine work and factory work. And in fact, Toyota had done something with that yellow cord enormously clever, right? Which is they had created a signal, or what we now call a trigger. And the trigger said, oh, wait, some uncertainty has crept into this process. We now need a different design, right? And so I now believe what makes Toyota Toyota, and the reason they're so good at designing factory work, is that they have developed a very clever system that cycles between factory work and studio work on an as needed basis, right? And that andon cord is a really smart way of moving you into, collaboration or a meeting when you need it, right? And if you think about this, it's a very simple idea, but it fundamentally changes your role as the would-be work designer, right? Because in the original theory, right, what was your job? Pick the box. Now, right, what your job is to design the signals or the conditions that move you from one box to another. And our experience has been is that once you kind of apply that lens to a variety of different processes, you can often get some big gains. And let me give you my favorite example of a place that needs this desperately, but we still haven't gotten it yet. So at MIT, I sat in our dean's office for many years, and one of the things that we would do every year was do the budget. And it was the most excruciating set of meetings that I ever went to, right? We would sit and go through the budget line by line by line by line by line by line. It was an enormous waste of time. My dean, the boss, didn't agree with that, but so be it. But the reason it was an enormous waste of time is that 90% of those lines did not change much from year to year, right? We were still going to turn the lights on. We were still going to feed the students, all that kind of stuff. And we had no criteria for escalating the few things that were really different into the meeting so that we could spend that budget meeting really working on the hard problems rather than just kind of serially signing off on things. Okay? So we have come to call this, as I said, a trigger. And a trigger is one kind of design parameter you can use to decide when do we need a meeting for this particular activity. Now, the other design parameter is what we call a check. And the basic idea here is that not every piece of work lends itself to defining triggers, right? Maybe it's so uncertain that there's no condition I can define that says, oh, hey, I can't assemble the trunk latch. I need to pull the cord. So there, a check just basically represents is what is the frequency with which we check in, right? So if we can't design triggers, then we have to choose what is the frequency with which we cycle from factory work into studio work, okay? And here is where Agile comes in. So I think it was Mesbah that mentioned Agile before, right? Agile, I think, is a really interesting sort of work design innovation, and it's one of the very few that has come off the factory floor. And if you know about Agile, right, one of its big sort of practices is the daily stand-up meeting, okay? Well, why might a daily stand-up meeting be a good thing to do relative to the way that, pre-Agile software was done, where you might have had a weekly meeting or a bi-weekly meeting, right? What I would argue is the cadence or the check frequency for software development of daily was much more effective than weekly because it turns out that developing software typically is a pretty fast cycle activity, right? And the way that I like to describe it is if you have two software engineers that know what they're doing, let's imagine one makes a design decision that's the equivalent of turning right and the other makes a design decision that's the equivalent of turning left. If they don't talk to each other, but every week, those two people can drive those two cars really far away, right? And I can see David and Kyle are sort of nodding their heads. If we check in every day, right, then we can find those defects a lot sooner. Okay? But there's a really interesting wrinkle here, which is I believe that the success of Agile has been widely misinterpreted. Okay. I cannot tell you how many companies I go to that don't do software and non-software related functions, and they have a daily stand-up meeting. And I say, why do you have a daily stand-up meeting? And they say, well, we're an agile company. Okay. Wrong takeaway, right? The message that I want you to take away is match this, the frequency with which you check in to the speed with which the work generates uncertainty. Okay. Right? What are meetings good for? They are good for resolving uncertainty and finding defects and sort of making decisions, right? But whether you need it or not is determined by how much the work has generated uncertainty that needs to be resolved. Okay. In the world of developing software, right, because it moves relatively quickly, daily turns out to be a pretty good cadence, right? There's other kinds of work that's tough technology or long cycle development. If you met every day, there's nothing to talk about, right? And then on the flip side, there are cases when daily is not enough. I remember in the early days of COVID when we were trying to figure out what was happening at MIT, for a while we actually met twice a day, right? And the reason was is the world was changing so rapidly that we would make a decision in the morning and then the governor of Cambridge would, issue some pronouncement at lunch and then we'd have to redo our work in the afternoon, right? So the thing that I want people to really take away here from this, and this is kind of the essence of that connect the human chain principle, is put meetings in the right places. And you have kind of two design parameters to think about, which is number one, what are the triggers, right? So those are meetings, that are triggered by a specific condition, right? So we only have them when we need them. And then we have other meetings that are checks. And the key design parameter here is I want you to match the frequency of those meetings to the speed with which the work generates things to talk about, right? And there's a very easy rule you can use to talk about, to figure out if you've got the meeting frequency right, right? If you have nothing to talk about, probably don't need to meet so often. But on the flip side is if a lot of your uncertainty processing is happening offline via electronically mediated communication, so email and Slack and so on and so forth, you're probably not meeting frequently enough. Okay? So to see that, let's talk about sort of the failure modes here, right? So imagine I have a factory level design. So this could be serial. Okay, thank you, Jocko. I know that I don't want to wade into religious debates about the different rituals and symbols here. So I apologize if there was some heresy somewhere in there with the, which is imagine you're doing serial work, right? Goes from me to David Tiani, and David comes across a defect, like something went wrong, but there's not well-designed work and he doesn't know to whom to escalate it. So what does he do? Well, let's imagine that he doesn't really know whether to call his boss. He doesn't know how to fix it himself. So he just passes it downstream. Okay. So what's going to happen? David, I know you'd never do that, but just as a thought experiment. Well, it's going to get found eventually, right? So maybe Tiani finds it, right? And so what's she going to do? Well, she's going to send it back, right? And so what we find is that if you don't have clear escalation criteria for defects, right? And so you end up in this box down here where you're trying to do ambiguous work, but with a serial design. The result is what you get is what we call ineffective iteration, right? And most of us live here a lot, right? What this looks like is that we are constantly emailing work back and forth with spreadsheets and Slack and instant messaging and so on and so forth, rather than just getting in the room to solve it. And let me give you one little anecdote that I hope will drive this home. I was giving an early version of this lecture a few years ago, and I'm talking away and drawing this picture on the board and so on and so forth. And I see a student who's sitting in the back of the room, and his face is just like falling, right? I thought he was going to start to cry. And so I kind of stopped class and I was like, hey, Joe, is everything okay? You all right? You need a minute or something? And he goes, no, I'm fine. He's just, you're describing my life. And I said, well, tell me a little bit about it. He said, well, so I'm a product manager at a tech company, and my job is to get products out the door. And the way our process works is we have three vice presidents that have to sign off on any project before we can release it to the factory. Okay, so it's like the technology VP, a finance VP, manufacturing vice president, or something like that. He said, but the problem is that these three guys don't get along with each other, right? And I can never get them into the same room. So my job is basically shuttle diplomat, right? I just go around office to office to office, holding the specs until I can get them to converge. And it's an enormous waste of time, okay? Right? This is sort of an extreme case of what we all do, right? Which is when we try to resolve uncertainty, rather than using a face-to-face communication, we are almost always going to end up in a world where we are trading way too many emails, way too many Slack messages. And those are often cases where just inserting a strategically placed meeting can make an enormous difference in our overall productivity. I'll just give you how I use this. I now have a whole bunch of teams that report to me at MIT. This is the sort of cost of being there for a long time. What I always tell to my groups is I will meet with you on whatever frequency you want, We can meet every day if you like. In trade, please don't send me an email unless it's an emergency, right? The things you need from me, make a to-do list, boom, boom, boom. We can go through them quickly. We can look at the calendar. If I need to send an email, maybe we'll do it right in the meeting. But if it goes into my email inbox, right, I just have more than I can manage. And, and half the time I don't get the information I need. So I got to send it back. Is this the talk in January or February? And it just creates this kind of endless do loop. Whereas if we do it face to face, it goes much faster. That's worked great for me. My co-author, Don Kiefer, when he ran a company called Intermatic, his version of this rule was whenever he was copied on an email that had more than 4 responses, so we all get these emails with multiple things, he would send an email to everyone on the thread and say, please take this off email and go find a room and just have a meeting, right? Because you will resolve it much more rapidly than if you continue to try to iterate in this ineffective medium. I know we're getting to the end, so I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip a couple slides here. I'll make these all available to you. So 2 practical takeaways on this part, which is number 1, just make the triggers clear. We've talked about this. And then number 2, as I think I've now said several times, as you go through the meetings you have in your organizations, just assess the frequency of those meetings and ask yourself, do they match what the work requires, right? Are we meeting too soon, too frequently or too infrequently? And then I was going to spend some time on the regulate for flow principle. I think I'm going to skip that one as well. I'm happy to answer questions on that. So I'm going to blow through a few slides on this one as well. So sorry about that. I'm skipping slides. And I want to just go back to the standard charter and then we could stop because I want to leave a few time for questions. Right. And the reason that I think this particular intervention was so effective is what was happening before was they were in the world of ineffective iteration, right? Which is that the project managers had to chase 16 different people around, right, in order to get them to sign off. And everyone, all 16 of those different risk managers were imposing their own priorities on what they thought was the most important risk, right? So if I'm the project manager and I have a project that has a big cyber risk and Tiani is the cyber expert, well, okay, I can probably get on her calendar pretty quickly. I can get her to sign off. But, if Matt is responsible for another risk category that is not particularly relevant to this project, he's probably got 10 other things he thinks are more important, going to be very difficult for me to get his attention. And so it's easy for the work to get lost in that iteration, right? By creating that common backlog and bringing everyone into the meeting together, right? David was able to, create a stand-up meeting that was focused on clear priorities, right? Because now we have a common backlog and you have all the sort of relevant stakeholders in the room. And if you think about it, right, even though this is only one meeting a week, it's going to have sort of huge sort of spin-off benefits because if you know your project is coming up on the list next week, you're probably going to change your behavior outside the meeting so that you're ready to go the next time that it shows up. All right, so let me stop there. As I said, I got a bunch of papers about this, which I can make available to you. And then finally, all of this is described in excruciating detail in the book that is dropped today. And if this is interest to you, would certainly appreciate it. But let's stop there, and I'm happy to take the last few minutes and see if we can answer a few more questions.
The chat is like so lively. It's kind of lit with all kinds of good stuff. And so I figured out where we left off with the question that was kind of lingering out there. And I think Matt, you are next up if you want to go with your question. I think it was about cooperatives and anything else you want to ask about.
Sure. So I guess where my head has been for the last couple of years is all of these places that you, I think, correctly identify aren't doing all these things that in theory are better for the theoretical outcomes they're supposed to exist for. They secondarily optimize those things for the well-being of whomever has power in the social system. And I use those words, and those can mean a lot of things. Different people will consider well-being differently, obviously. So my generic question was, corporations can look lots of ways from small to super big. Power is more distributed when they're small, just inherently, than when they're super big. But contrasting your time that you've worked with large corporations, I don't know, maybe if you have this experience, because it's not very common, or if you have any opinions about how if the problem is as frequent, or if the solution that you posed is just sort of manifesting more naturally in worker cooperatives specifically.
So it's a really great question, and I'm not sure I have a definitive answer. So let me say two things, one of which I have a fair amount of confidence, and the other one is going to be very speculative. The part that I have a lot of confidence is one thing that I've noticed, and I'm surprised this hasn't come up so far because it's something that I often throw out, is organizations often have fleeting experience with what good work design looks like, and typically it comes in the time of crisis. If you ask people, what is your most, energizing, satisfying experience in your career, very often, the stories that you hear will be, we had something go really sideways and everybody dropped everything and we got in a room together and we figured it out, right? It's kind of their own personal Apollo 13 moment. And if you think about that, right, I think the reason that works so well is in a crisis, the target suddenly becomes super clear. They are often widely shared, right? So we need to bring people back from space or whatever it might be. And I think the other thing that happens in crisis is, Matt, a lot of the kind of power broking and, nest feathering that you talked about tends to kind of temporarily dissipate because everybody knows if we don't figure this out, we're going to lose the whole thing. And so we better sort of get our act together. So, what that says to me is that organizations have it within them to do it right. But wouldn't it be nice if we could have that kind of performance without having to really screw something up first? Um, and so I think the second answer to your question, which again, this is going to be the crisis thing, I'm pretty confident. This is going to be much more speculative, is I would be willing to bet that there's not an enormous difference between the different ownership structures, at least to first order, because I think most of the problems, and this will reveal my kind of, sort of scholarly bias, most of the problems we've been talking about is because the work is poorly designed. Now, if you had work that was well designed, would you see a difference between kind of corporate oligarchy versus worker collectives versus things? Yeah, you probably would. But I think the design elements kind of swamp any of those individual sort of difficulties. And I'll give you one of my versions of this. Like I have had the good or ill fortune to do a lot of work with private publicly traded companies and with a bunch of different big US government agencies. Fannie Mae is described in some detail in the book as an example. And, right now, if you read the news, like, people talk endlessly about, government agencies are so bureaucratic and they're so slow and so on and so forth. I don't see any difference when you control for size between the speed and agility of for-profit and not-for-profit organizations, right? I think it has much more to do with the size. And think you see just as much nest feathering and sort of power broking and not-for-profits and so on and so forth. What I fear is what you're dealing with is the sort of human condition more than any kind of differences in the ownership structure. Purely speculative on my part. This is not something I've researched or I have a lot of expertise in. And so I think the big difference really comes down to, can you develop a set of shared targets that are genuinely shared? And can you organize the work so that people can get the positive feedback from actually making a difference in terms of the work that they're doing? And if they can't, if you cannot connect the work you do to the outcomes that the organization cares about in a meaningful way, then I think you are almost immediately lapsing into the world that you're describing, which is people are going to focus on their own kind of self-interest because they've got nothing else to focus on. Now, you need to satisfy Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? If people aren't getting paid well and they can't eat and sleep and all that kind of stuff, then I don't think, you should be surprised the kind of behaviors you get. But again, I don't see, when you get to big organizations where people are well paid, personally, I don't see a huge difference in the behaviors that are induced by the different ownership structures, with the one caveat that I mentioned earlier. If you ever come across a manager who has lived through, particularly fatalities, but any kind of major crisis, I think they often run their organizations very differently than people who have not had that experience. So take that. I don't think that's even worth 2 cents, maybe like half a cent or something like that. So
Thanks.
Just before we move on, do you have a hard stop, Dr. Penny?
I do not. I don't believe, but let me double check my calendar just to make sure that. No, I can definitely keep going for a few minutes.
Okay. I only see one more question queued up from Kyle. We could use the hand raise from here. also, if you want, since we're gonna just opening discussion, feel free if you would like to kill the screen share now, and we can all
Okay.
just
Yep.
be in there. Yeah. And yeah, so I guess Kyle, you can go, and then other questions, please feel free to raise your hand, and we'll get through as many as we can.
Cool. Yeah, and thank you again for doing this. This is love this conversation. So totally agree the sort of bureaucratic nightmare of everybody wants to say and all the sign-offs, but I'm also seeing these large ecosystem components of our tech stack that now have a whole bunch of business critical tie-ins that create multiple accountable executives that now we're going to shift capabilities from SAP to Salesforce. This is going to impact multiple people's day-to-day line of business, that sort of stuff. It's going to require a few dozen people to sign off on it. Changes their risk, changes their processes, their whole org and their strategy. The alternative is that scream test that I was talking about before, where a change happens and then it's on them to recover later. So what's your thought on that reduction, that those sort of trans boundary resources, the way that we think about those orgs now that it's not a clean categorization of just somebody owns Salesforce, because just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question and it's a hard problem. I mean, I think it's easier to say what's not to do. I think there's some good, not great research out there that serial sign-off processes are probably not the way to go, right? I sign off and then I send it to Jocko and so on and so forth. I think that just creates trouble. And I read a study long ago that, if I know that I'm signing off and I'm the fourth person in a six-person chain, not actually going to spend a lot of time looking at it. I'm just going to sign, and then they're going to complain later. I think, and I realize the numbers are a little bit of a challenge here, but I think you're going to need a forum where you get the stakeholders, or their designates in a room together, which is going to be hard if it's going to be 24 people. Probably the most important thing to do, and this is going to be, where whoever's the leader in this context is going to earn their salary and then some, is you need a clear set of targets, right? And it's going to be hard to come up with those targets because different people want different things. But, the kind of blood, sweat, and tears that go into that, I think are going to be worth it. And then what I would really recommend in this case is once you get past the target setting, I think this is a place where the visual management techniques can really earn their keep in terms of helping you create a visual that can coordinate, probably the multiple different tasks and threads. And the other thing that visual management techniques do very well is they surface places where things are not going well, right? When an issue comes up, right? If you see it on the board, it's a pink post-it or a flag in the digital system or whatever, then you can use that very expensive meeting if you've got 24 people for what it's good for, which is to sort of work through all the headaches and differences. Now, this is not a visual management assignment I would recommend for your sort of first foray, but you're stuck with the situation that you're in. But I think this is a place where a good visual representation of how the work is going, it would be the only way that I would know how to do it. Just to give you an example, I didn't really spend a lot of time with this, but one of the lead users for all of our stuff, which is described in the book, is the Broad Institute. They're across the street from my office. They grew out of the Human Genome Project, so they're the world leader in gene sequencing. And they have a visual management meeting to manage their tech development portfolio each week that actually has more than 50 people in it. And so they're actually able to coordinate a lot of activity using the visual tools. Now, to be fair, they've been at this for more than a decade, so they've got a lot of skills in this area. But yeah, that would be my recommendation. And if you're interested, I could point you towards some resources for people that might be able to help you out a little bit.
Yeah, thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Barbara.
Thanks. Sorry, I couldn't find my virtual hand. I just want to, there's a couple of threads in the chat that I was sort of wanted to pull together for all of this. And I realized that we all here on this call have talked about visual management systems and all of these other things for many years. However, that is not what is happening inside many of the organizations that Dr. Penning is talking about. Yeah, Kanban, yeah, is one of the great tools, right? I was recently, not that recent, well, relatively recently told that I shouldn't put sticky notes on the wall because it might ruin the paint job. So, there's a real like, and the people who are running organizations have often graduated from business schools that are far less enlightened than the program that Dr. Repenning is describing. And the other thing I will say is, I don't mind a good 2x2. The problem is that in many organizations, everything is turned into a 2x2. Even things that should not. And those of us who are familiar with the Cynefin framework know how many times we have to say, no, it's not a 2x2. You're not looking to identify the domain immediately, categorize your problems based on this framework. So a lot of what we're talking about here is not what we know, but the issues that we face inside the organizations we're trying to interface with on a daily basis. Because it is often rooted in a much older way of thinking that we have to overcome. I mean, I went to business school with guys who I'm like, dude, really? And they're and they're like, I was like, there's stuff that's happened. And so I'd really like your take on this too, as we try to face these managers that came up in a very particular system, and we try to change the thinking around something as simple as putting sticky notes on the wall, but also something as, complicated as changing a way of work.
Yes, I have a bunch of reactions to that, which is as much as I might wish otherwise, I'm not sure that my institution is beyond culpability. I think our executive MBA students, I ran that program for many years, I would certainly hold them to a little higher standard, but our MBA grads, I fear not. And I think there's a couple things going on. One thing I would highly recommend if you have never read it is a very old book called The Human Side of the Enterprise by Douglas McGregor. And McGregor is famous for what he calls Theory X and Theory Y. And I can give you the kind of Reader's Digest version, which is basically, it's not even a 2x2. It's just, there are two types. But, he said, there is one type of organization where you believe that people don't really want to do the work. They're going to slack off the moment you turn your head. And so the way you should run that organization is you should put in a lot of surveillance. You should break the work into tiny little bitty tasks. And, you should basically just watch people at every moment, because if you don't, they're going to try to screw you. And then there's another sort of type of organization where you believe that people want to do the work, so you don't have to control them as much, and that they get some intrinsic value, and so on and so forth. So he calls these Theory X and Theory Y. But McGregor's big insight is that those two beliefs on the part of managers are largely self-fulfilling. Meaning that if I believe people that are lazy, dumb, and stupid and don't want to work, I'm going to take actions as a manager and design the work in ways that is going to make that come true, right? Whereas if I believe people seek self-efficacy and actualization and actually really want to do a good job, I'm going to design the work and behave in ways that also makes that come true, independent of any individual differences of the people who walk in. And to me, this is just an incredibly deep and important idea. And if you care about the sociology, it's, an example of the self-fulfilling prophecy, which comes from the older Robert Merton. And yes, the binary classification, I think, is always problematic. But I think, Barbara, part of what's going on is that Theory X of you got to watch people or they're not going to work is so embedded in the way that people are trained and kind of the management dogma that we get, that I think we all, myself included, will fall prey to it if I'm not careful. And there's a whole host of ills, I think, that follow from that. And so I think it's just something that you need to be on the lookout for. But then I think the problem that you raise is a very important one, which is, okay, fine, that makes sense in theory. I walk into practice with all these dudes, that were trained a certain way. What do I do? And the answer that we have in the book, and whether it works or not, you can decide, is on top of, or sort of next to the dynamic work design principles is the approach. And the approach that we define is very much incremental in that pick a problem that's in your area, use the principles, solve it, put some points on the board, and then go on to the next problem. So it is really kind of aggressive, creeping incrementalism. And the reason for that is twofold. One is I think organizations are too complicated that you can solve them in one big change initiative. But also, I think it's just a much more realistic way to get people on board and help them slowly move from a theory X to a theory Y mindset. Because as you continue to generate results, people are going to start to look, hey, what's Barbara doing over there? Wow, you're really starting to do some new stuff. And I just don't think there's any way of creating sustained change that doesn't involve kind of incrementally, sorry for the sports metaphor, putting points on the board and slowly enrolling people. And I know that's a tough pill to swallow because if you've been frustrated in an organization for much of your career, thinking that I'm going to solve this problem over the course of years with little incremental projects is not the most satisfying answer. It would be a lot better if I could give you a pill, the sort of Ozempic for organizational functioning. Um, but I just don't know of another way. So I think the approach is probably equally important to the principles.
Let's see. I see some more questions here. Actually, Heather, if Heather's still here. Let me see. Yes, I see your question.
I think Nelson actually answered it by saying that you have to do a bunch of really small projects, get wins on the board, and then it will slowly turn into a Y organization.
Yeah, and I think actually just to follow on that, our experience has been it will feel very slow in the beginning, but the progress is not linear. And that those first few projects, which will feel tiny, typically have a far bigger impact on the rest of the organization than you might think. I'll tell you a really quick anecdote. One of the examples I blew by, which I'll put in the slides, was a student of mine who works at Analog Devices, big semiconductor company, and he did a project where he cut a month out of their R&D time for a chip that they were developing, just for one project. So he scoped it down. He did everything we told him to. But it turned out that there was a sibling project on the West Coast, was not part of his project at all. But they actually, a month later, were able to do it even another couple weeks faster than his project, even though that hadn't been part of his focus. And of course, what was going on is, as you all know, the informal information transmission network in organizations is pretty effective. And the West Coast team was like, well, I don't want to be left behind with what Mike's doing over there. So they were keeping tabs on it and then were able to kind of, innovate even farther on what Mike had done. And so I think if you can generate real results, particularly if it leaves people actually feeling better about the work that you're doing, it does actually propagate faster than you think. But I've also coached enough students and enough executives in those initial sort of early efforts when you're starting small. It requires an act of faith, and it can be a little bit uncomfortable because it really feels like you're working below your pay grade. And that, in the kind of coaching and consulting that Don and I do, that's one of probably the three biggest hurdles that we have to get people over, is that it's not a waste of their busy senior executive time to kind of go focus on some small little area.
Thank you. Nice to see you again.
Okay, any other questions? I had one. When you talked about, so I read one of your older white papers I think you wrote with Dr. Stoneman, and I remembered seeing that sort of model that you created around like the capability and erosion over time. And it was what struck me, and one of the things I took away from it was the building mechanisms for learning, accelerating learning, and bringing learning further upstream as possible, as far upstream as possible. And that's kind of like what I took away, or how I articulate it, as one thing from it. And the idea of kind of like theory of constraints a little bit, because in that paper you talk about how like errors happen sometimes very distant in time and space. A defect can occur very distant time and space from not just the cause or the causes or factors at play that cause that defect to come to life. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that from like your research, from that, even from the modeling perspective, and yeah, just how you anything more you can share around that and what you've discerned.
Yeah, so what I would say, I think that the top line, and then I'll give you some of the sub bullets, is these are very hard systems for human beings to learn the right lessons in. Okay, the human brain is good at a lot of stuff. Learning in systems with long time delays, particularly if you get sort of multiple impacts that happen on different time scales, it's just not something we're good at. John Sterman's run a bunch of experiments I've seen a lot of time. So I think this is a place where things don't necessarily come naturally, and it's easy to draw, the wrong conclusions. And, we can start with a very simple example, right? If I think I used this earlier. If I run a factory and I fire a couple of my maintenance mechanics in the short run, my numbers look great, right? Maintenance mechanics are expensive. And if I've done a good job of maintaining the equipment up to that point, things are going to get worse, right? And so it's easy to learn the wrong lesson that, okay? But then the problem gets way worse because if I pump up my numbers and they look great in the short run, what happens to my career? Well, I might get promoted, right? So now, Tiana, you're the new plant manager, and I'm off in the corporate office, right? With my loafers looking out the window or whatever. I'm long gone before all the bad stuff, the sort of chickens come home to roost in that context. And then worse than that, if you're having a tough budget discussion where you're trying to hang on to those mechanics, right? The finance person's going to look at you and say, well, Tiani, if I keep these five maintenance mechanics that I want to get rid of, how much money are we going to save? Right. And you're going to be like, well, I don't know. It's hard to say, right? Incidents are random. There's a probability distribution, blah, blah, blah. And the finance person's going to say, well, I know exactly how much if I save, I get rid of them, they're gone. Right. So there again, we come back to that asymmetry in terms of measurement. So that kind of worse before better thing is a really hard situation again for human beings to develop the right mental models, right? It's just a hard situation to learn. And then, right, if we add into this tipping point idea where actually it works fine as long as you use it in the right dosage, then it's an even harder sort of learning challenge because as long as I kind of move them back and forth, in small increments and we stay above that tipping threshold, basically things look better. But then I could kind of creep to that line, and then suddenly when I push it over the edge, things, are get really bad. So point one is I think it is really hard to learn the right lessons in that context. So how has humanity sort of learned over the years to kind of deal with those particular sort of situations where bad things happen, but only rarely? Well, typically we develop kind of rituals, that we follow that are kind of hard and fast rules that can sometimes, almost turn into sort of religious style things like thou shalt not, which I think work pretty well, except that they're not super adaptable when the world changes. And so then we have this kind of meta learning challenge of, okay, we had this set of rules that worked great. I mean, I'll give you a kind of funny one, which is sort of personal to me. IBM was very famous in its heyday for its salespeople always wore blue suits and white shirts. My dad was an IBM computer salesman, right? Anybody know what the root of that was? Why they wore blue suits and white shirts? So the rule was is you were supposed to dress like the customer, right? So think about selling computers in the late 1960s and early 1970s, right? A computer was a multi-million dollar item in 1970s dollars. And who was the person that was going to make the decision to buy this thing? They didn't even have CIOs back then. It was probably going to be the CFO of the bank or the insurance company that you were calling on. What did they wear? They wore shirts and ties, right? So that was a very functional rule for 1970, right? And it got kind of hard coded into IBM's culture. Fast forward to the 1980s or 1990s, right? Now every other IT guy in the world has got a ponytail and a t-shirt and a calculator on their belt or whatever. And all these IBM guys are walking in with suits. They look like idiots, right? And it took Lou Gerstner as the outside to come sort of realize that this rule that had been so helpful in one epic now, had become very sort of, dysfunctional in the later one. And so I think for these situations where it's hard to learn, right? There's just kind of layers and layers of challenges that we face as a society in terms of figuring out what's going on. And so I think this is a place where getting people kind of more up to speed with how complex adaptive systems work and sort of learning to spot some of the basic dynamics that happen, sort of over and over and over again is super helpful. When I taught system dynamics, I used to tell my students, I was like, look, most of you are not going to be professional modelers when you grow up, but
Yeah.
there are a set of recurring dynamics that you will see in a lot of different situations. And if I can teach you to spot them, right? Even intuitively, you're going to be in a better position than someone that's trying to kind of learn in those situations sort of naively. And so, the work of this group and the kinds of things you're talking about, I think are really important precisely because this is not something that people are going to learn without the aid of kind of theory and sort of other,
Yeah.
sort of structures. That was a long-winded answer to your question, but
Yeah, I think no, that resonates because I've often we even drew this out on a team that I was working on, and this idea of like that there's a work mix, and sometimes the tactical, like just action result kind of work is favored over the step back and challenge our assumptions, which is like improvement work. Like it's not considered work sometimes. But then what you've just said is also like learning is important, but learning the right things at the right time, spotting certain signals. There's something like under that that's like important to like drill into and to understand as well.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think it's really tricky. If you take Google, I don't know if they still do it, but for a long time they had this thing where you get a day a week to work on, you kind of your ambitious moonshot personal projects, right? I don't think that's crazy in the sense that that was a sort of smart way of saying, okay, we got 4 days, I want you to grind away and deliver shareholder returns, but then we have one day where you can work on sort of the pie in the sky stuff. But then, I don't think any of their pie in the sky things have really worked out in terms of, so we need a little bit of structure, to do that, but probably not as much as you need from the other pieces. So I think it really becomes this kind of design problem to get to the right stuff. And the other way that I would sort of put it, maybe this is as good a place to end as any. Um, as I said earlier, I think the results are always easier to measure than the capabilities that generate them. And I think sadly, we have entered an epic, and in a weird way, AI may be contributing to this inadvertently, where we are not valuing the kind of qualitative expertise of people who touch the work on a regular basis as much as maybe we used to. And if I go back to oil refinery maintenance, right, grizzled mechanics can smell a pump or listen to it a little bit differently than they did before, long before the monitoring systems, could tell you that a bearing is going bad or something like that. And I have a student who's studying electronic medical records right now too. And I mean, the battle between docs and AI and Epic right now is truly epic in terms of what's happening in hospitals. It's a stunning. This would be a whole other topic we could come back to later. So I think we need to balance, the strong desire. Like, obviously, we like quantified numbers better than we like subjective assessments, but there's a lot of important things in life that still we can't measure with 3-digit accuracy. And I think the work design needs to kind of include, some of that subjective expertise that is very easy to get lost if you're not careful.
Yeah.
I have to challenge that binary between quantitative measures and subjective qualitative, because I think that implies to me that qualitative isn't evidence-based and fact-based. And for those that are deep in it, I don't think that's the case, even if it's not numerical. So that's just a comment.
So I totally agree with you, and I've been a qualitative researcher other than modeling my whole life. So I think the point I was trying to make, which I didn't do a very good job, I was actually agreeing with you, which is I think, human experience is encoded in a variety of ways. And we have become kind of, I mean, this has happened through my whole career, sort of increasingly obsessed with so-called sort of hard numbers or quantification. And I think we do that at our peril, in fact. And so
That's the corporate mindset.
yeah, exactly right.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
everybody would benefit from treating the, more subjective experience as a really important data stream. And particularly when it comes to the things I've been talking about, like kind of the more upstream capabilities, often the quantification either doesn't exist, or when you try to quantify it, you can often make things worse rather than better because they are things that are difficult to measure. I mean, just to give you one little preview of coming attractions, um, my student, I won't say which hospital system she's working with, she's studying how docs interact with the electronic medical record system. So she has a case in that where a doc is treating a patient who is literally dying of sepsis and is interrupted every 15 minutes by the electronic medical record that is asking him, "Are you checking the patient for sepsis?" Right? So our desire to kind of routinize everything like is running headlong with a very experienced person that's trying to save someone's life. And we're a long way from getting those systems to kind of appropriately value the kind of different ways that we understand how the world works. So that'll be the subject of another paper. I can come back and talk about that one at some point. So
Right, I'll hand off to Barbara.
Okay. Well, Dr. Penning, thank you so much for joining us today. This was awesome. I learned a lot. It really, engaged me with a lot of thinking that I've been pondering for a while, and it coalesced a few ideas for me. Please come back anytime to talk about this work, other work, whatever you'd like. Also, thanks to all of you for joining us. We really appreciate that you've all taken the time to be here today. If you're new to the lounge, please come back. We have a lot of very interesting speakers coming up. And if you're an old friend, thank you so much for the support. We have some exciting programming coming up in the fall, so please stay tuned. And with that, I will say thank you and bye.